The fact is that there's very little that's self-evident when it comes to prophecy, really almost nothing. And I'm going to show you why that is. Why do people disagree so vehemently when it comes to biblical prophecy? There are actually reasons for it, and I'm going to give you a few of those. By no means not all of them, but a few of them. So what I want to do is I want to illustrate the problems, again, plucking a few examples out, and then apply the results of those difficulties. So illustrating the problem. Problem number one is something I call clarity of intention. Basically, this is the issue or the problem of how do we really know what the biblical writer of a prophecy intended as far as fulfillment, or what was the intended meaning or the intended outcome. How do we really know? Now you might think, well, this is kind of easy for the most part, but it actually isn't. And I'm going to pick a very familiar passage here, Isaiah 7. Now, everybody knows Isaiah 7:14, right? Behold, a virgin, the Hebrew is Almah, shall conceive and bear a son, and so on and so forth. His name shall be called Immanuel, which is God is with us. It's not a name, it's just a phrase. It's a verbless clause for you grammar geeks out there. Something that's so familiar actually isn't that clear. And for the sake of the audience, I affirm the virgin birth because it's taught in the New Testament. Isaiah 7:14, though, is actually tough. There's a reason why, now listen to this, there's a reason why no Jewish interpreter, Mishnah, Talmud, all that stuff, considered Isaiah 7 a messianic prophecy. Nobody did. And here's the reason. Have you ever looked at the verses that follow verse 14? We have here, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son and shall call his name Immanuel. Verse 15, he, the child, shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted. If you know anything about Isaiah 7, the king of Judah, Ahaz, has a problem. There are two kings threatening him and his dynastic line, threatening the kingdom. He's scared. So God sends Isaiah to go visit him, and Isaiah says, hey, look, these two guys that are troubling you, don't worry about them. They're not a problem. God's going to take care of this. Go ahead, ask God for a sign, and that'll encourage you. And then Ahaz tries to be pious and says, oh, I just don't think I'm going to ask for a sign. That would be imprudent of me. And so Isaiah gets a little ticked at him and says, okay, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin, Almah, shall conceive, bear a son, you shall call his name Emmanuel. And by the time the kid's old enough to eat solid food, by the time he's weaned, 2 or 3 years, in Israel, and our own experience, by the time he's able to discern good and evil, eat solid food, your problem's taken care of. The sign is for Ahaz. It is fulfilled in Ahaz's day. Right here we see it. Well, how do we get Matthew down here quoting it of Jesus who lived 700 years later? How does that happen? Is Matthew making it up? Did he goof? I mean, critics will say that. I think there's a clear answer for that. I think Matthew sees an analogy in the circumstances of Jesus' birth. We know that Mary traveled with the 12, and it was bigger than a group of 12. And Matthew, traveling with Jesus for 3.5 years, Jesus' mom's often in the group, and, he's going to hear the story, about how Jesus was born. And then when Matthew gets older and it sort of dawns on him hey, I'm getting old, maybe I should write this stuff down, for posterity. He's thinking about, okay, where do I start? Well, let's kind of start at the beginning with the birth. And it's oh yeah, I remember that story Mary used to tell us. And he sees an analogy. This was a supernatural birth. It's just like Isaiah 7, where God had a child supernaturally appear to take care of a problem, to save who? To save Ahaz, who was in the line of David. So Matthew's reasoning by analogy, but the point is, if you looked at the whole context, you would never guess that this has anything to do with an eschatological ultimate Messiah, because the circumstances are given to you. Point blank, right in the text. So I bring that up to reference the point, how do we know what the original intent of a prophecy is? Because you kind of want to know that to know how it's fulfilled, to know what to expect. Another one is Matthew 2:13. This is where Matthew says, again, he's recounting the circumstances of Jesus with his parents. They had to go down to Egypt to get away from Herod, and then they come back. And Matthew says, this happened because it is written, out of Egypt I have called my son. Well, did you ever go back and look at Hosea chapter 11? When Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. What is that a reference to? The Exodus. Okay, think about the answer you just gave, and it's the correct answer. It's the Exodus. It's not a prophecy. Hosea 11 is not looking forward, it's looking backward. But somehow, we see it in the New Testament as though it were a prophecy. Again, Matthew, my view is he's thinking in terms of analogous circumstances, because the only other place you see my son, God's son, in the Old Testament is of the nation of Israel. Israel is corporately called my son. When Moses goes into Pharaoh, what's the demand? Let my people go worship in the desert. Let my son do this and that. And then we also have it of the king, the Davidic king. So there's a conceptual connection there. When Matthew's writing the story of Jesus, he's thinking, wow, this is just like that. It's an analogy. And so Matthew puts it in. This is what God was thinking. But if you just stick with what Hosea is thinking, he's not looking forward. He's looking backward. How can a backward look be a prophecy? Again, there's a little bit of a disconnect between what you might read and what you might expect. So we have to deal with that. So it raises the issue of how do we know what the original meaning was? I mean, is that even possible? Sensus planor is a Latin phrase which means fuller sense. Do prophecies have a fuller sense? And if they do, how would we know what that is? Because we can read a statement and look at it and sort of think, well, I think I know how this is going to work. And then if it has a fuller sense that you can't even really conceive of, how are you going to figure that out? It's a built-in problem.